Okay, thanks first of all, again, Tony, and to Ulster GAA for inviting me along to do this talk. You've certainly put the pressure on the start, Tony, by talking about evaluation straight away. So hopefully I can do you and Ulster GAA justice. Just a bit of an introduction, I suppose. Um, I suppose you'll have read some of this in the bio about what this session is about and what we hope to cover in around about the next 45, 50 minutes or so. I'll sort of aim to do my stuff in that time, and then leave some time for questions at the end. And really what I'm going to focus on here is the role of sports psychology to help develop a positive team environment. Now, this is a very broad area, and there's an awful lot that we could try to squeeze into an hour. So what I've done is I've maybe selected a few areas that I think are quite important, and maybe take a deeper dive into a few of those areas than we would if we were doing a broader range of things. You will see on this slide, I am going to be using a couple of times during this webinar something called menti.com, which is a survey kind of polling platform or instrument. I'll put a link in here in the chat. And if you're able to, open another tab and go into menti.com during this, then great. Or you might need, to use another device or something like that. And it's just a couple of little questions I want to sort of get your views on as we go through this, and just to get a little bit of interaction as we go through this as well, which is always good. This is kind of the plan for the evening, and this is what I hope to go through tonight. So where I'm going to start, actually, I'm going to talk a little bit about what is a sports psychologist. And I suppose that, it's certainly, I think, important to me that if I'm working with a sports team or if I'm working with an individual, that they feel, I suppose, to a certain extent reassured by, my qualifications, my accreditation, my background, my knowledge, my expertise, all those kind of things. But I think for you as a coach, it's very important that, if you're considering getting somebody involved with your group or with your team, that the person that you're working with and that's getting involved is appropriately qualified to do so. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what is a sports psychologist. And I think one thing that I'm always very clear on is, if you are a coach and if you are considering working with a sports psychologist, never be afraid to ask the person the questions about, their background, their education, their qualifications, and as you might do with a physiotherapist, as you might do with a doctor, as you might do with a strength and conditioning coach or anybody else who might be involved in your group. So we'll start there, and I'll do a little on that, and then really from there, then I'm going to talk about the coaching environment, and these are kind of, I suppose, a couple of key things I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk a little bit about resilience, which we might often think is kind of an individual thing, a personal thing. But I am going to talk a little bit about how your coaching environment can influence and develop somebody's resilience. I'm going to talk about something called psychological safety. And again, how that's an element of your coaching environment. And most importantly, this isn't just telling you about these things and presenting some theory that has maybe very little relevance to what you do. What I really want to talk about is how you can introduce and develop these things within your environment, and give some very practical ideas of how you can do that, because that's really what it's all about, the how to do these things. I'll talk a little bit then about the final point down here, developing coach-player relationships. And again, maybe a little bit more than that might be immediately obvious about what a coach-player relationship is. And again, like I said, how you might develop that, how we might work on that as part of our environment. And then at the very end of this time, we'll talk a little bit about reflective practice, and just one or two very quick things I want to say about that. So we'll see how time goes for us on that one. Just a little bit about me, first of all. Tony, I suppose, mentioned a few things there from my background in terms of teams that I work with. I work as a sport and exercise psychologist and a lecturer in Ulster University. That's the day job. And I suppose as part of that, you'll see on the slide here, my research at the minute really focuses on, I suppose, a couple of broad areas. One is a lot of my research has looked at psychology of endurance events like running, what people think about when they run, how it helps them run faster, run better, help make physical activity like running more enjoyable. But more recently, I've looked a lot at, and I'm closely monitoring the number of people in the room here, and I hope it grows rather than anything else as I go through this. But I do look at referees and things like referee abuse, etc. Predominantly in the GAA, but we're spreading that out to other sports at the minute. And really, I suppose, and some of the things I'll talk about kind of reflects even some of the work that we're doing there, about how we can support our referees, develop our referees, etc. The other thing that you see here as well is HCPC registered, and the HCPC, the Healthcare Professions Council, is really, I suppose, the body that regulates our industry, psychology broadly, as well as many other healthcare professions, but really regulates that area, not just in sport and exercise, but broadly. And so what I wanted to do was talk a little bit about, what exactly that means and what you might look for from a sports psychologist if I suppose you want to have somebody who you would say is appropriately qualified. I've linked here an article that was written by Dr. Kieran Kearney right about maybe a year and a half or so ago. And it's a really nice article where Kieran breaks down this idea of a performance coach and makes a distinction between a performance coach and a fully qualified sport and exercise psychologist. And Kieran does a great job in this of explaining exactly what a sport and exercise psychologist is, and what you might expect from somebody who's appropriately qualified to work in this area. And I suppose to give you a broad kind of outline in terms of what work somebody might have done to be fully qualified as a sport and exercise psychologist. First of all, that person might have maybe done an undergrad degree in psychology or sport and exercise science. My own undergrad was in sport and exercise science. And then kind of worked through, typically after that, you might do a master's focusing specifically in sport and exercise psychology. That's considered stage one. And even with somebody who's fully, qualified with a master's in sport and exercise psychologist isn't at that stage a fully qualified sport and exercise psychologist. The step that comes next is a period of supervised practice experience, where basically somebody works through an accredited route under the guidance of a fully qualified sport and exercise psychologist who works as their supervisor through this process. And typically this maybe takes 2-3 years, depending on the route and the work the person's done and how much time they can dedicate to accumulating a certain number of hours of supervised practice. And at the minute, in the north, really, I suppose there's two main routes. One is through an organisation called the British Psychological Society, and they have a qualification in sport and exercise psychology. And then there's another more recent organisation, or an organisation who've more recently developed an accreditation pathway called BASIS, and theirs is called the Sport and Exercise Psychology Accreditation Route. So really somebody who goes through this process, develops competencies across a broad area of psychology, really at the end of this journey, at the end of this route, can then apply for something called HCPC registration. And you can check this. So, if you've got somebody who's maybe calling themselves a sport and exercise psychologist, saying they're fully registered with HCPC, fully accredited, you can actually check this on the HCPC website, and just simply going on, checking the register, entering their name as a practitioner psychologist, and checking if they have, I suppose, the qualifications and accreditations that they might say that they do. And really, that's very important, I think, to ensure that you're working with somebody that's appropriately qualified to work with your players or work with your team. In the South, it's not quite at the same place yet. They are through an organisation called CORU developing these type of register and developing these accreditation routes. And you can again go on and look at that, and you'll see sort of updates on that. And really what they're working towards is that similar idea as the HCPC of having a register for appropriately qualified, in our case, people who work in sport and exercise psychology. So I want to give that just a little bit of a background, just for your own knowledge, and I think it's quite important just for your own knowledge at the start. And like I said earlier, never be afraid to ask somebody of what their qualifications are, or what their maybe experience might be when working in this area. Okay, so I'm going to move on then. So I guess into the meat of the session, I'm going to move on to the coaching environment and the couple of things that I mentioned at the start about the coaching environment. And I suppose, what I hope you'll take from this, I suppose my goals for this session is that, through this webinar, you might reflect a little bit of a few things from your own coaching environment. Some of those, no doubt, will be excellent and very, very good. So, if I'm sort of talking about things that you can say, yeah, we do that in our place, then brilliant. It's confirming maybe good things that you do. But also, hopefully, you'll maybe pick up one or two things from this that you'll think, okay, that's maybe something I might want to work on or introduce or whatever into my setup. And when I talk about the coaching environment, broadly just to explain, so we're all kind of speaking the same language here. I guess, I kind of talk about a number of things, and broadly, I'd probably start saying, if I was to walk into a coaching session or walk into the room with management, coaches, players, etc., what would be the vibe in the area? A little bit deeper than that, what would be some of the experiences somebody might have if they're in your coaching environment? Would they be positive? Would they be nurturing? Would they be caring? Would they be supportive? Would they be challenging? Would you be sort of challenging players to improve? What would the standards be like? And what would be the expectations around those standards? So those are some of the things that we maybe think about when we talk about the coaching environment. And I guess you as coach and your coaches are really the key people who set that environment and set the tone and set the vibe about what that environment is what is important to you, what's important to this group, how do I want to be as a coach, and how do I want this group to be when they're with me and when I'm coaching. And you'll kind of see a lot of words highlighted in this that sort of emphasize what are parts of what we talk about when we talk about a coaching environment. And there's two in kind of the third last paragraph of this. It says importantly, your coaching environment, it should be challenging and supportive, an essential combination to help participants thrive. And that's something I'm going to talk a little bit about first when I talk about something called resilience. And I wanted to start here because I think for two reasons. One is resilience is probably a word, and you'll see obviously some recent articles in here, probably a word that's used almost all the time when we talk about successful teams and success, across all sports. But I think it's also a term and a word or a concept that's kind of maybe sometimes misunderstood in terms of what it is and also how we can develop it. Because I think very often we think somebody's either resilient or they're not, or we think certain people have it and certain people don't. But one thing I'd like you to take away from what we're going to talk about in the next 10 minutes or 15 minutes or so is that actually two things. Resilience is something we can develop, yes, on an individual level within an individual person, but also there's key things in my coaching environment that I can do to help foster that resilience and to help develop that resilience in people and to help people, I guess, display resilience when we want them to do so. These are a few, and I don't want this to be like a, my day job at university lecturer, but, I do want you to take away a few things about what resilience is and what resilience isn't. These are some ideas about what resilience is. So again, we're talking about the same thing and using the same language here. So it's the ability to use personal qualities. So I'll explain what I mean by personal qualities to withstand pressure. This second one's a key one for me, the ability to maintain performance and well-being when under pressure. Normally, and again, going back to those headlines, we think about resilience in terms of performance, but actually resilience also relates to the well-being of people in your group. And so, it's not just about performing, it's also about being well and being, healthy, if you like, in a mental sense, for the people that are in your coaching environment. A dynamic process resulting from the interaction between you and your environment, again, highlighting the environment is important, and a preventative and proactive approach to managing stress. What does that mean? Preventative and proactive really means that we can work on it. We can develop it. We don't just wait for people to demonstrate resilience when they're under pressure in a game or whatever it might be. We can actively work to develop it so that when that pressure comes on, people have the tools and the skills they might need to still perform at their best. And that's really what, a big part of what this is about. Things is not, I'll kind of summarize these in one or two lines. It's not a fixed trait. It's not you either have it or you don't. And also importantly as well, the last one, it's not the absence of emotions and not the suppression of emotions. When we're under pressure, we all experience emotions. If a player makes a mistake in a game, they feel frustrated. It's normal. It's a very natural consequence of wanting to do your best at something. So it's not saying that people don't experience these emotions, but it's saying that we can do things to still maintain our performance, even if we experience those, and even when we experience those emotions. That's really a little bit about what resilience means. And so I suppose what I want to talk about is, okay, how do we develop it? Or again, if I'm a coach, what can be features that I can think about in my coaching environment that will help my players develop resilience as we go through a season, a coaching session, whatever it might be. I want to start with the personal qualities first. And what you see on, and this is not the key focus of the session, but I want to make, I suppose, a point here for two reasons that I'll explain as I go through it. First of all, what you see in this little image here, the triangle, this is based on a resilience training program, if you like, that was developed by people who've done a lot of work, researchers who've done a lot of work in this area in a sporting context, David Fletcher and Mustafa Sarkar. And really one thing they've developed, and what I'm presenting here is a mental resilience, or what they call mental fortitude training program. And really the idea is, what can we work on? What can we train? What can we develop that will help people to demonstrate resilience? The first part I'll explain here is in the green circle, the personal qualities. So what do we mean by that? So I guess two key things. One is personality. And this may be where the idea of resilience, you either have it or you don't, comes from, because there are certain personality characteristics that are related to higher performance under pressure, and maybe being able to deal with pressure a little bit better. And we can probably all, we all have experience of that. Some people are a little bit better at this than others. But for those others, it's also something we can develop and something that we can train. And I guess the key thing to say, and I'm not going to go into it here, but personality traits are difficult to change, and they're pretty resistant to change. But we can develop mental skills, and we can develop these, I suppose, coping strategies through psychological training or mental skills training. And that's something I want to talk a little bit about first. So the first thing I'm going to do, and this is where I want a little bit of feedback at the start. So I've got 6 mental qualities or mental skills, if you like, that I've got up on the slide here. What I want you to do is, if you can, I want you to go into menti.com. So again, you'll find the link further up in the chat, or just literally, if you can, Google menti.com. You'll see it on the screen there. And what you should have is, it'll ask you to enter a code. So the code, I'll just put it up on the screen here in a second. Okay, so the code is, hopefully you can see this on your screen, 58770471. Okay, so I've got people coming in. So what I want you to do is pick the top 2 of these that you think are most important for the players that you work with. So is it to be optimally motivated? Be able to regulate thoughts or emotions? Hopefully this is working for you. If it's not, just put a comment in the chat box. Is it to be able to maintain? Yes, there we go. It's working. Happy days. So I'll just wait a minute or two for these to pop up. Just to finish the points, is it confidence? Is it their ability to handle pressure? Or is it their ability to manage relationships? So things like communication, etc. So what do you think is the most important qualities? And just pick one that you can, well, or 2, I've said on the screen, pick 2, that you think are most important for the players that you work with. I'll give this about 30 seconds and then see what we got. Okay, so I know this will sort of change around a little bit. So we've got confidence or self-belief at the top, and straight away I will say, in most groups that I work with, when we do things like this, when we survey things like this individually across players, confidence nearly always comes out as the top one. And usually, I suppose, the thing I kind of adds after that is, very often we develop confidence and we work on confidence, not by directly working on confidence, but by developing sources of confidence, and where do people get confidence from? So, for example, is it confidence in my physical fitness, for example? Is it confidence in my skills? Is it confidence in my ability to handle pressure? So maybe the mental skills side of things. Manage relationships, communication, great. Okay, so that'll be a big focus of what we're doing tonight. Maintain attention, focus, regulate thoughts, emotions, handle pressure, and then interestingly, the last one down there, to be optimally motivated. Okay, so those are, I suppose, some just your perceptions of some of the most important things. And really, I suppose if we're thinking about psychology and sport and exercise psychology on an individual level, this is really a lot of the work that a sport and exercise psychologist might do when working with a person individually, of many things, but this might be just an example of one. And so, for example, I just put this in here as a very, very simple example. And again, we're talking about resilience and we're talking about people's ability to perform under pressure. And you know, one thing that I always kind of start with as a very simple strategy is taking slow, deep breaths. You know, when you're under pressure, if you're nervous, if you're anxious, if you're whatever it might be, here you'll see these arrows go in for a count of 4. So that's a breath in, pause for 1, and then a slow breath out for a count of 6. And really, this is about just when you're under pressure, if you're feeling stressed, anxious during a game, you've made a mistake, and you're feeling frustrated, it's a very simple skill just to help to regulate that emotion, to regain focus, to regain composure, whatever it might be. And you'll kind of see this sort of links with a lot of things that were in the previous slide. How does this link with something like confidence? Well, if I know I've got some tools or techniques to help me manage my emotions in a game a little bit better, then I take confidence from that. I take confidence knowing that even if something I don't want to happen happens, like making a mistake, I've got something to help me deal with it. And that helps. That helps. It makes that mistake less of a worry, if you like. And so that's kind of one part. And that's just a very, very simple example of mental skills and using techniques and strategies to help develop mental skills. The certain part of this mental resilience or mental fortitude training program is something called a challenge mindset. And I want to give you just an example of that as well. And again, this might be an example of something that a sport and exercise psychologist might work with individually with a player. And I kind of start, I guess, at this point, and kind of explain that, number one, and this is something that takes a while to get your head around. But number one, when we talk about a challenge mindset, it's understanding that certainly in sport, certainly in football, hurling, camogie, whatever it might be, nothing that happens to you, no situation, no event that happens to you can directly make you feel a certain way. We kind of think this is how it works. A mistake makes me frustrated. Big games, I get nervous, make me anxious, whatever it might be. So we think that maybe situations and events directly impact on how I feel or even how I act. And so I go into my shell when I make mistakes or in big games. And so I don't express myself or play the way that I want to, for example. But this isn't really how it works. And this isn't really how our brain works. No situation can directly make you feel or act in a certain way. What does make us feel or act in a certain way is what I think or what I believe, or the phrase I kind of use, the story I tell myself about that situation. And I guess, you know, as a sport and exercise psychologist, what you might spend a bit of time working with players on is, you know, their responses to situations. How do they think or what do they believe about certain situations? So what might they think about making a mistake? What sort of thoughts might they have if they make a mistake, and in turn, how that makes them feel? And I guess I wanted to highlight this for a key reason, is that it takes a lot of training and a lot of work and a lot of education as a sport and exercise psychologist to be able to do this well, and a lot of supervised practice to be able to discuss how you do this and a lot of ways that you can work on this. And so if you've got somebody in your organization who's not appropriately trained for this, then really they can do more harm than good. And again, that refers back to my earlier point of a sport and exercise psychologist and ensuring you've got someone who's appropriately trained to do this. One thing you probably are familiar with, though, that I guess is a bit of a phrase that's used quite a lot, is about controlling the controllables. And this becomes relevant when we talk about a challenge mindset, because it's understanding that even if I can't always control a situation that happens in a game, before a game, whatever it might be, I can have some control over how I think and how I feel in that situation. And so understanding that maybe what I can control is my thoughts, my responses, my beliefs, the story I tell myself in response to that situation. And so that's a little bit about how I understand control the controllables in that context. So that's a little bit about, I suppose, the personal qualities and what a sports psychologist might do when working individually with a player. But what I want to focus more on is this side of the environment. And I kind of want to make a really important point about the environment here. And I'm going to relate this to this question here. Why do flowers sometimes struggle to grow? And the reason I'm going to sort of use this comparison is very often as a sports psychologist, when I come in to work with a team or even working with an individual outside of GAA, very often I kind of maybe spend some time with that individual or in that group. And I do sometimes kind of realize, well, it's not all about the person. If we think about the flower analogy, if you've got a flower that's not growing the way you would like it to, or blossoming and blooming as you would like it to, you don't really look at the flower, and you don't really look at the flower and say, well, that flower is not a great flower, or whatever you might say. You look at the environment that the flower is in. You look at the soil, you look at the nutrients, you look at the water it's getting, the sunlight it's getting. And so really very often what we do is we work on the environment, not on the flower itself. And it's kind of, the same in sports psychology. Sometimes more of the important work can be done to develop a healthy, a functioning, and effective environment. And that in turn helps the individual to grow and to blossom in that environment. So this, I think, is quite a nice phrase to remind of that. It's not what your head, it's not what's in your head. It's what your head is in, the environment that you're trying to navigate as a player or even as a coach. And this is why the environment can be so important to work on. So, okay, what sort of things in terms of resilience then are important for a coach and environment? I'm going to sort of present a little 2x2 framework here, and I'm going to set you up a little bit for a question I'm going to ask later, because as I'm going through this, I would like you to kind of reflect, right, what is my environment like? When I go through this, and I'm going to present 4 kind of categories here, where would I put my coaching environment as it is right now? And again, you'll know your context. And I will say, when you're answering the next little thing, no individual responses will appear, but it's really just for reflection for you. So what we have here are 2 elements of our environment. Challenge and support. Okay, so I suppose the first environment that we might have is something called a stagnant environment. Okay, and this is an environment characterized by low challenge and also low support. This is basically an environment where not very much is happening. It's, we're not really performing very well. It's not really much learning. Definitely not much growth in this environment. Probably describe this as a pretty static and boring and, not a lot happening sort of environment. People are not really challenged, and there's also not a lot of support in that environment as well. Still on the low support side, though, this is almost a huge part the opposite of a stagnant environment, something called an unrelenting environment. This is an environment where there's a lot of challenge. Okay. It could be a very stressful environment. It could be an environment where there's a lot of expectations on players. Let's call it, a certain case comes to mind, a lot of rules for players to follow and things like that. But maybe not a lot of support in this environment to help players navigate that environment. And so because of that, it can be a very stressful environment. It can certainly be linked with poor performance, lower well-being, an environment where you maybe experience things like burnout, an environment maybe where people would rather leave that environment because it's not a healthy place for them to be. So this is an environment characterized by high challenge and low support. And I'll explain a little bit as we go through this about, I suppose, what exactly support means. Well, so support could be development on some of the mental skills that I mentioned earlier. So it could be work to help players perform better in that challenging environment. And that challenging environment, by the way, could be, in competition and things they experience in competition that they don't really maybe have the mental skills to deal with. So support could be training in those mental skills. And it could be the relationships that we develop. It could be something called psychological safety. And I'll go into that in more detail in a few minutes' time. But these are elements of what we can do to add support to that environment. Okay, so the next environment, this is an environment characterized by, so maybe I've added a lot of support to the environment. I've got excellent coaching in there. Players ask for nothing. They've got absolutely everything they could possibly want, but they're comfortable. They're not challenged, certainly not challenged in a way that will get the most out of, number one, I suppose, maybe possibly their abilities, but also for the support that they're getting, for the coaching that they're getting, for the training, the education, whatever words you want to use that they might be receiving. In a comfortable environment, players can still be performing well, and certainly well-being will be really, I suppose, less of a concern in this environment, but probably not performing as well as they could be. We might say in a comfort zone or whatever phrase that you might use. So we might think this is a performance where people are well supported, but because they're not challenged, maybe not reaching the heights that they could possibly reach, if you like. And I kind of use that last phrase deliberately because I'm going to give you an example of how I kind of think about challenge and using that phrase, not reaching heights that somebody might do. This is a facility called Biosphere 2 in Arizona. Biosphere 1 is our planet. So they call this Biosphere 2. It was built in the late 80s, early 90s. And the idea was that really it was sort of an experimental facility to see if we could create a completely sealed atmosphere that replicated the Earth, but within the sort of buildings that you see on your screen. And really at that time, the idea was if we can build something like this on Earth, we could maybe build something like this on another planet in the future. And in this environment, they have things like, rainforests, deserts, marshy areas, the sort of stuff that we see around our own countryside, maybe grasslands, all that sort of thing. And they wanted to see if you could sustainably live and grow things in a sealed environment like this. And they ran a number of experiments. And one of the experiments that they ran, and one of the findings they got was about trees. And what they found was in this sealed environment, trees could certainly grow very well. They had sunlight, they had, this was Arizona, so they had sunlight, they had nutrients in the soil, they got water, all that sort of thing. But when the trees reached a certain height, they started to break and fall down. Literally, the trunks would break and the trees would start to fall down. And they didn't know why this was. So they looked at the timber in the trees and they realized that actually the timber in these trees, despite having all those, nutrients in the soil, etc., wasn't as strong as trees in their natural outdoor environment. And what they realized was the one element that these trees didn't receive was wind. And what they realized was that as the wind blows and the trees sway and that sort of stuff, that makes the timber and the wood in the trees stronger. It responds to that stress. And by responding to that stress, it gets stronger and supports the trees to reach their full height. And what I kind of think about that, I think about that wind as a challenge, something that challenges the trees, but by also getting the good support, a good fertile environment, etc., these trees, with a combination of challenge and support, can blossom, can fully grow as they should do. And this is really, when we think about an environment with high challenge and also that high support, we call this a facilitative environment. And this is the sort of environment. I have a few things listed here. I'll not go through them all, but it's really that sort of like high performing environment that we probably all crave and that we all want in our teams. So where maybe players seek out challenges, they want to be challenged. They want that opportunity to show what they can do under pressure, if you like. They crave feedback from you as a coach because it's a learning environment and they want to learn to get better. Two really important points here. In this environment, calculated, and I'll explain that term in a little while, calculated risk-taking is encouraged. We want people to take risks because there's reward from taking risks. But also with risks, there's an inevitable side where people make mistakes. So how do we respond when people make mistakes? Do we sort of, discourage them from trying anything in the future? Or actually, do we have an environment where we can learn from those mistakes, grow like the tree from those challenges, those mistakes? Do we have certain environment where we're all in this together? And if a mistake is made, right, we take the learnings together and we grow together from those mistakes. And you'll see the last 2 points, which I've now mentioned a couple of times. So the question I want to ask next, and we're going to go into Menti again, but it's a different code this time. And it'll just take me a little second just to set this up on your screen. Just challenging my ability to do two things at once, but hopefully I'll get there. So if you go back into Menti, and this time enter a code. Sorry, my screen's just a bit slow to load. So your code this time is multiple things open. So your code this time is 35. Oh, this might not work. Sorry, I think it's actually logged me out. Hang on, it's telling me to upgrade. Imagine suddenly a time it asks me for money. Let me just see. I think I might actually be logged out and I might need to log in again. If I can't do it in time, I'll just leave it and move on. Okay, I think what's actually happening is because there's so many people logged into it. I think that's why it's not letting me present. So apologies for that. I'll just move on. It's not. How do we respond to mistakes? Are we all in this together? Okay. Hopefully so. Really, I suppose what I wanted was a little reflection there on your own coaching environment and where would you put your own coaching environment? And I think a good reflection on that is sometimes also to think about maybe environments you've been in the past. Where would you have put those? Would you have considered those facilitative, comfortable, stagnant, unrelenting, whatever it might be? So the next bit I suppose I'm going to go through is a little bit about, okay, how can I add challenge? I'll do a little on that. And then how can I add support? And that's where this idea of psychological safety comes in. And really, I suppose I kind of view these a little bit of as kind of two dials, turning up challenge sometimes. And maybe my knowledge as a coach and my knowledge of the group that I work with maybe tells me, okay, here's a time that I need to challenge them a little bit. But also maybe knowing, okay, here's a time where I need to support them a little bit. And that might be with learning or whatever it might be. I guess there's lots of ways we can do both. In terms of adding challenge, just a few ideas on that. I suppose one, that I haven't got on the slide here, but sometimes you add challenge by maybe, kind of reflecting with your group, what are our expectations of each other here? What are our standards? What's important to us here? And are we living up to those standards and those expectations? And that might be adding, I suppose, a little bit of challenge in terms of, the standards and how we do things in our environment. These are a couple of other ideas. During a training session where I want to help players get a little bit more comfortable with the idea of, performing under pressure and bringing out some of the skills that might help them deal with pressure. So I might add, for my drills that I do or games that I play in my training session, I might add some meaningful consequences. So these might be things like forfeits or rewards or something like that. It could be, if I'm doing a shooting drill and you're asking me to hit 4 out of 5 or something like that, there might be a forfeit, some sort of, let's say, fun, but, say, sometimes there's a consequence of not reaching that target that we set. It might be a forfeit for me. It might be a forfeit for others if I don't, kind of reach whatever standards you're looking for, and that adds a little bit more pressure. Things like leaderboards or monitoring performance, very often we do things like shooting drills, but they just run for a few minutes and we don't really monitor what's happening, how successful people are. But actually monitoring really adds pressure and really puts a bit of a focus. And the idea here is that, people will miss, okay, how do we learn from that? How do we respond to that? What sort of mental strategies might I use to be more focused again for the next one? And that's all sort of practicing performing under pressure and really allowing some of those attributes to come out, like the mental quality, the mental skills that I might have learned through the support in my environment. I think adding a player's choice to that, letting players come up with these things like forfeits or whatever, again, it's their ideas, but it's also their ideas of how we add pressure, how we add challenge to our environment. Simulating competition demands, especially the mental demands of competition. I think we, very often do this pretty well for maybe physical demands, but what about simulating competition mental demands? So, for example, how will I handle what I think is unfair in a game? Be that maybe an unfair call against me, which happens in a game. How do I handle that? How do I deal with that? Can I bring that into my training to put a little pressure on players? Again, adding a challenge to my training environment. How do I bring in maybe some uncertainty to my environment? This could be very simple things like, you're doing a small-sided game, we've got even numbers, and then suddenly you pull a player out, or you add an extra player into one side, and let players reorganize themselves, organize those things, communicate what's going on. Again, you're adding pressure. You're maybe making that competition a little bit unfair for a while, but that happens in the game, and it's helping players and teaching players how to respond. Again, using the word to that challenge. So that's a few ideas, I guess, of adding in a training session, adding challenge alongside maybe support. And then I suppose the support can sometimes come in on the reflections afterwards. How did we deal with that? Did we do that well? What can we learn from that? Here are maybe some ideas of how we can do that better the next time. So that's now supporting alongside the challenge that you've got in your environment. And so there's some of the whys, and really it's helping players maybe perform a little bit under pressure so that they grow and they adapt, and that idea of the tree experiencing some wind to help it grow and get stronger as it does so. In terms of support, I'm really going to focus on this one area called psychological safety, and I guess give you a few ideas of what that means, and again how you can sort of bring it into your environment a little bit. And the green, by the way, is where we're at so far in the session. So we're coming along nicely. And I'll aim for about another 15 minutes or so, and then I'll pause it there depending on where we get. But in terms of psychological safety, I want to give you a few ideas. And this really, I suppose, is, well, predominantly I kind of think about this as the supportive side of your environment. there's also a little bit of challenge in here as well. And it's not really just about being a nice environment, and definitely not being a comfortable environment. The idea that we saw earlier when we were talking about resilience. So what is psychological safety? So this is kind of a bit of a definition at the top here. And this comes from somebody called Amy Edmondson, who did some original work in business settings and medical settings around psychological safety. And what she realized in her research is that, especially in medical settings, that the most high-performing teams didn't necessarily make less mistakes, or there wasn't less mistakes in their environment, but actually it was how they responded to those mistakes and how their, individuals and groups responded to those mistakes as opportunities for learning, or maybe, in a negative way, opportunities, I guess, for criticizing or whatever else negative that might happen in an environment. And here she talks about punishment or humiliation in some way. And I think, in terms of psychological safety, how would you recognize it in your environment, or what would a psychologically safe environment actually compromise or compose, or what would it look like? So what might I notice? Okay, here are some things to think about. In your environments, do people, and I put people in here deliberately, not just players, maybe other coaches, people in your environment, do they speak up? Do they ask questions? Do they raise concerns? Is that a feature of your environment? Do people actually actively ask for help or ask for feedback if they feel they need it? And also, as a coach, it's not do you give it, it's can I give it? Can I give it in a safe, constructive way? Do people take calculated risks, or do they play safe? And so this idea of a calculated risk, it's not a risk that, doing things that are, kind of using the phrase, I suppose, going on a solo run or anything like that, going away from what you're about as a group and maybe a game plan or whatever. But it's a calculated risk where they take a chance, they back themselves because there's a reward for doing so. So do they take calculated risks? Acknowledging that breaks down sometimes and mistakes happen. So how do we respond to those mistakes as coach or as players? Do we respond in a learning way, that we learn together from those mistakes, for example? Or the definition. Is it an environment where people may be sometimes humiliated or punished in a way for making those mistakes? And that could be just by the verbal response they receive, for example. A psychologically safe environment isn't always a nice, in inverted commas, environment. Some of the most, what I would call psychologically safe environments that I've been in, actually been really challenging environments where people have challenged each other's ideas. And if they don't agree, it's an environment where I feel safe disagreeing with the coach or another player or whatever it might be, knowing that it's for the greater good of the team and it's not personal. It's a very, I suppose, it's an environment where people feel safe to challenge, and they know that by challenging, they won't be shot down or humiliated or anything like that. So it's not just about being nice all the time. It can actually be quite a challenging environment, but again, for that greater good. And I suppose, for you as a coach, do I adapt to the needs of the individual and the context? Do I recognize maybe actually that for some people in my environment, they might need more challenge, and for others, they might need more support? And do I respond appropriately to those in my environment as well? And I suppose, you might think this is very soft, and this is, and here's me challenging what I've just been saying to you, but you might think this is very soft, and you might think this isn't something that you would get in a high-performing environment or anything like that. But I'm going to play actually a bit longer than I normally would, but I'm going to play about a 3-minute video clip here, and this is this actually was in 2020, so you'll hear reference to COVID in here. But this is Jim Gavin talking a little bit about his experiences in the aviation industry. And how he applied that to the Dublin football environment. So hopefully you'll be able to both see and hear this.
No volume. No.
No volume, Tony?
No volume.
Oh, how do I fix that?
Unless the rest have volume, but I don't have.
Give us a thumbs up or thumbs down if you don't
thumbs
have
volume. Thumbs up or thumbs down, coaches.
No sound. Okay. Right. Rather than listen, I'll tell you what I'll do, Tony, and you tell me if this is possible. Can I share these links afterwards with to you, and they be sent on to the coaches?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. No worries. Right. What I'll do then is I can hear it on my side, but unfortunately it's not coming through for some reason. What I'll do, Tony, is I'll send you 2 video clips that I would show. I'll send them on to you with a bit of an explanation about them, and then just forward on to the coaches.
Grand. That's great.
Okay.
Great.
Okay. No worries. Thanks, Tony. Okay, so really what that video clip explained, or would have explained a little bit about, is, I guess, how for that Dublin football team, really, I suppose, a key thing in terms of psychological safety was how they sort of responded to mistakes that they might make, how they made that sort of learning environment where it wasn't this environment where, as you might expect, sometimes in a really high performing environment that, you know, it's no mistakes are made here and people are shut down if they make mistakes or whatever it might be. Actually, it was a really learning environment, supportive environment, and we're all in this together type environment. And he talks in that both resilience and also psychological safety as part of that resilience in their environment. So I'll send that on just for you for afterwards. A few ideas here in terms of how we can create psychological safety in our environment. So I suppose a couple of things. Number one is about social skills, and very simply what I mean by that is, you know, it's not just mental skills that I've been talking about earlier. It's about knowing people. It's about knowing the players that you work with, knowing the individuals that you work with, and knowing what they need. And I mentioned earlier, you know, sometimes it's more challenge, sometimes it's more support, and that might also depend not just on their experience as a player, but also in their life in general. It's about the value of something called conversational turn taken, and some of the information that I've taken here comes from this little image that you see on your slide, and that's a really nice document to look up if you want to learn more about something called psychological safety. This idea of conversational turn taking basically means, you know, I mentioned earlier, do players speak up in your environment? And there's lots of different ways that we can do this idea of conversational turn taking. It can be literally in meetings. Are people given opportunities to speak? Do they speak even if not invited? You know, which is I think a great feature of an environment. It doesn't always have to be in that way. It can sometimes be even, you know, do you request feedback by surveys on WhatsApp, whatever it might be? Are people given an opportunity to give their views, give their opinions, and it's treated as valuable as maybe your own opinions when it's given. And again, those are examples of very psychologically safe environments. Safe is not the same as comfortable, and I think we probably saw that already. Safe can also be challenging, and it's not that idea of a comfortable environment that we saw for the resilient stuff. People are promoted to take calculated risks. One thing that Jim Gavin mentioned in that video clip, he talks about, you know, it's not being absolutely careless with things that we do, but actually these ideas of calculated risks that can pay off are encouraged, knowing that mistakes happen, and that key thing about how we respond to those is a key part of encouraging, and the messages you give to players about encouraging those calculated risks. Do we take collective responsibility for errors? Again, these are all features of a psychologically safe environment. And can people be themselves in this environment? I'm a Kerry man originally. A player might walk into my coaching environment wearing a Cork jersey. I'd be disappointed. But players can be who they want to be. They can wear what they want to wear. That's okay. And that's part of the environment. And I just use that as an example of, can people express themselves, whatever express themselves might mean in your environment, not just what they wear or whatever. Can people be themselves? And I guess, you know, what I would say is, if there's elements of this that you think, okay, that seems useful, that seems important, that seems like something I might try it. I think probably one of the most uncomfortable one here for coaches could potentially be that idea of calculated risks and how we respond to that, being okay with people making mistakes and how do we respond to that. Try and see the responses that you get. Try and see how performance changes when you try that. What is the longer term result of doing something like that? And really reflecting on your environment by maybe trying different things that you may not have as a result of maybe some things hopefully you've learned tonight. The last thing I'll focus on, the last thing I'll talk quickly a little bit about is developing good coach-player relationships. And I'll try to get through this in about the last few minutes that we have. Are we okay, Tony, if we go to about past?
Yes, that's perfect. No.
Okay. So in terms of relationships, this is something that I think is quite a nice idea to do. And this is actually something that in groups that I work with, I do quite a bit. I do it mentally, but when you're in a big group, I also write this down. And I kind of do this as a bit of a check-in, maybe, you know, weekly, bi-weekly, even monthly. And really it's a little bit of a check-in of all the people in my group. Have I reached out to them? Have I made some sort of connection? Have I checked in on that relationship on a regular basis. And very often, the way I kind of tend to do this is, I kind of put arrows from the coach, maybe me, the coach, whoever at the center, and then the players. And I've just 7 examples around here. And I kind of check in, how have those relationships been? Have I had a conversation with somebody in the last while? And how have they responded to me in that conversation? So I might give an example here of this particular player. This could be my captain, for example. We speak quite a bit, good working relationship, know each other quite well. So, the 2 green lines represent a good relationship. I might have a very different, but again, a good relationship with another player. It might be, this player isn't maybe like a starter on my team, but actually we enjoy the crack and we've good crack together. So it could be that sort of social type relationship. And again, it's reciprocated by the player as well. I might have relationships where actually, this one maybe with Sean is a little bit on me. I haven't spoken to Sean in a while. I've sort of, said hello and things like that, but haven't really had a proper conversation. So I might think of this as one I need to check in, but it's been on me. I need to maybe sort of make the effort, have a 30-second, minute, whatever conversation with Sean at the start or end of training, just so he knows that I know that he's there. And again, part of checking in with that relationship. I might have certain players where I've reached out to, I've had a good chat with, but they haven't always maybe replied to me, for example, if it's on WhatsApp or something like that. Or actually, when I was speaking to them, I didn't get a good vibe. So I might say, right, there's a player I need to check in with. What's going on there? Is there something I need to follow up with that individual? I might realize there's players who've reached out to me and I haven't really supported them, or I haven't got back to them, whatever they might have been asking for. Dahi might be an example of that. And so I think, I need to get back to them. I need to have that chat with them. They reached out to me looking for a bit of help with their shooting or whatever. And so much going on, I totally forgot. So again, that idea of checking the relationship and the supportive side of that relationship or whatever. And I might actually realize in some of this, like Marie here, I haven't spoken to that person in a while. They're always training, they're motivated, but actually I haven't said anything to them in ages. And again, that might be one where I need to check in, see how they're getting on, see how they're going. I think this is a good thing to do, because sometimes people might feel in your environment they're not valued, they're not important. And because there's so many people in your group, sometimes this can be easy to happen. And it's why something like this can be really, really good to do. And the last one here, I'm also not saying that you're going to get on with everybody in your group. There might be an example where I don't get on well with this individual and they don't necessarily get on well with me. And that happens, but I'm going to give a few ideas, I guess, for all of these different types of relationships, of a few things that we can maybe do in our environment. And I'll go through this maybe a little bit more quickly than I would have liked to. This is typical of me. I typically over prepare things and then I have to run through things quickly at the end. So I'll go through this, but like I was saying with Tony, I'll follow up a little bit with more information on this if you want to afterwards as well. And I apologize if I am going through things a little bit more quickly than I would like. This is a model that was based on hundreds of studies about coach-athlete relationships. And I suppose the key point I wanted to make here is that, number one, the relationships matter. Relationships in your coaching environment matter. The relationships you have with other people, be it players, other coaches, whatever it might be, they matter to your environment. They're a huge part of that supportive, psychologically safe environment. And I think one thing that I work on when I'm first in a group is develop the relationships first. Then we can start to work on other areas in the environment, and it's safer psychologically for everybody to do so. But there's more than one part to the relationship. It's not just about being, sort of close, this first one here. It's not just about liking people, trusting people, although that's hugely important, and everything helps if you've got that trust and that liking and that kind of emotional side of a relationship. There's other parts. There's what's called commitment side of a relationship. This is maybe more the thoughts you have about people in your group. It's do you still intend to work with these players? Do they still like and intend to work with you longer term? Is there a good working relationship there in that way? And what are your thoughts about that relationship? And this is maybe more on a kind of working as a coach and player side of things. There's something called complementarity. And this is maybe more the behavior side of things. And this is where we kind of think about things like maybe our standards, our expectations of each other, what we actually do as part of our relationship. And so you might think, okay, as a coach, there's certain expectations players will have of me. Do I live up to those expectations? But I also have expectations of players as a coach. Are they living up to my expectations in that way? And so this complementarity idea of, are we living up to each other's expectations? Are our actions reflective of maybe our thoughts about each other, for example? And then something called co-orientation. This is called the 3+1 C's model, because originally there was these first 3 C's, and then later in the research, this third one was added. So 3+1 C's model. And this is sort of the idea, again, about sort of expectations and training and competition. It's broadly our thoughts about our relationships with one another, the degree that we have similar perceptions, how we see things. And the orientation idea basically means, are we on this journey together? Are we moving and pulling in the same direction together? And again, that's a huge part of this relationship as well. And what they find in this research is actually developing these relationships through all these different means relates with better performance. It's not just about well-being, but that's a huge part of it too. Better performance, better well-being, better relationships, not just with the coach, but also amongst teammates, because I guess as a coach, you're modeling some of those things. Higher quality motivation. That was something that was coming out in our poll as quite important. So higher quality motivation to train and to play. And higher self-belief, that was top of our poll. Higher confidence, higher self-belief, based on even just the relationship that we have as a group and as a coach and a player within our group. So what I'll do, because I'm conscious of time, I do have a few ideas about how you can sort of develop each one of these. Develop closeness, commitment, complementarity, co-orientation. I'll not go through all these now, but what I'll do is I'll send those afterwards again via Tony, and I'll send a few ideas and a few of the slides that I would have followed. That I would have gone through as a follow-up with Tony as well. So Tony, I'm going to pause it there. I've done a little bit too much. That's typical of me, but hopefully there's something good to take from that.
Brilliant. No, you're inside. You're on the air there. It's not brilliant. I see there's a hand up there. We'll take questions here. I see.
Yep, absolutely.
I'm seeing Treasure from Muff and Donegal. That's a hand up. I have unmuted you, and you have a chance of putting on your camera if you want to and unmute yourself. Do you want something to ask Noel something? No. Right. Anybody else wants to ask Noel any questions? If you put up your hand, I can unmute you so you can talk to Noel. Anybody at all? Eamon, Devon there, hold on, Eamon. I will allow Mike. Go ahead now. You can unmute yourself now, Eamon.
Hello, Noel. Thanks for the presentation. Very good.
Hi, Eamon.
So just in psychological safety, Noel, I focus on trying to help coaches about half times. It's a phrase comes up a lot with coaches. Do you have any tips for coaches to kind of create a safe environment, a psychologically safe environment at halftime? Because it's frequently mentioned by coaches. Thanks.
Great question, Eamon, and I know your session on halftime was excellent. I think I suppose applying to that very specific context. Probably two things immediately would come to mind, and what I would kind of think about immediately is that idea that, who speaks at halftime, first of all? Is it all from the coach or players kind of sitting there, maybe just taking in passively, whatever it might be? Or is there an environment where, players can voice their opinion and it's taken as part of the idea of how we change things, how we do things? I think that's something that's developed through your day-to-day interactions. It's not just at halftime that we suddenly can kind of do that. But I think really, I suppose my perspective is number one, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, but number one, players are the ones in the middle of the game. They're the ones that see things that a coach doesn't always see. So if there's an environment there where players don't feel safe to give their ideas, to give their thoughts, that it will be taken on board, maybe sort of elements of that psychologically unsafe environment, then ultimately I think that's going to impact on performance in a negative way, because not all the important issues will be seen. So I think my tips, my thoughts, it's really, if that's a normal part of your environment, day-to-day interaction, that players know they can say those things without being shut down or whatever, I think that comes into halftime as well. So that'll be probably my thought. Make it part of the norm in the group.
Okay, super. Thanks, Noel. Thank you.
Right, we'll go to JP Owens. JP, I have also allowed you to turn on your mic and your camera. Do you want to ask a question there, JP?
Yeah, thanks very much, Noel, for tonight. I'm just asking the question, Noel, in a training session, if you have an intent, like somebody that's an attention seeker, How do you deal with it? How he's disrupting the group? How would you go about that, or have you any advice or tips?
What do you mean? Would you define as an attention seeker?
Say, for example, that you're doing drills and whatever, but they're carrying on messing about. They're talking when you're meant to, when they're probably meant to be listening. You're trying your best. You're just really testing your patience, so to speak.
Yeah. I think for me, there's a lot of elements to that answer, and I probably more talk about okay, the ideas of kind of like what might be useful to have in place to help with that. Again, I suppose number one for me is there's a need there. Maybe having that conversation with the player, getting to know that player, getting to know what that is. There's maybe a need there that's not being met. So let's say, okay, have that conversation. Maybe you can be, depending on the type of conversation you can have with a player, because part of what I'm sort of hearing there, that bit I mentioned about the relationship and the expectations you might have with me as a coach, but in that case, the expectations I have as you as a player. So it's maybe sometimes a very open, honest conversation about those expectations and what you see, and even sometimes what does the player see from their perspective. I don't think there's anything wrong with having that. Again, I talked about psychologically safe environment. We can have very honest conversations, not about humiliating somebody, not about calling out somebody in a group, but actually having a very honest conversation, whereas you as a coach can say, look, this is what I see, this is what I feel when this happens in a coaching session. Kind of laying it out like that. But also from the players, I think a key thing with that, and this is maybe sometimes where it goes wrong, very often that idea of conversational turn taking, very often it's a coach venting on the player. And I'm not saying this would happen, JP, but very often it can be a coach venting on a player and the coach saying, this is what I want. But going back to what I said, sometimes maybe there's a need there, and maybe the player really wants, to have that conversation, but allowing the player to speak in that conversation. What do they see, when they're doing that, and exploring that a little bit. That for me would be a starting point. We can speculate what happens from there, but that for me would be a starting point.
Brilliant. No, well, thanks very much. Thanks, Tony.
Thanks, you. Secretary at the Asia there. Good man. You've come in there. Could you ask the question?
Yeah, cheers, Tony. Thanks, Noel. Just my experience might be a bit different because we don't have games as regularly as you would in Ireland. I coach the ladies team here, and I've done asking for feedback after training sessions. We've got a ladies rep, but trying to find out what they want at the end of sessions, or in terms of getting feedback through the players directly or through a ladies rep, sometimes with radio silence. Okay. I'm trying to make because we don't have regular matches as much as you would in Ireland. Trying to find out what will bring them into training. Would you have any tips or techniques that might be adaptable or applicable towards that sort of scenario?
So it sounds like, what's your name? Sorry.
Cormac. Sorry.
Cormac. Sorry. Yeah, Cormac. So it sounds like, Cormac, you kind of you put the question out there and nothing comes back in the group when you're kind of asking for that feedback. Yeah,
just like in terms of what, like I've done what, and when it does come back, it's from sort of senior or more experienced players, and I want to try and draw some of the other players in or get their feedback, and maybe they're not confident enough to do that. Through what the session did tonight, I was thinking after training, I'll stay behind for 15 minutes if anybody wants to come and chat to me directly.
Yeah.
But beyond that, is there anything you could sort of adapt from your experience?
Yeah, I think a few thoughts straight away. I think first one, sometimes, because it can be daunting for people in a group to speak out, especially like you mentioned, there's obviously more senior players and less, newer players, let's call it, whatever. So I think sometimes maybe sort of having smaller groups, and you might want to say, I just pick a number randomly, but let's say you have 20 people in a group. So you might want to maybe for some very specific topic, get them into smaller groups of 4 or 5, and then ask one person in that group. This is something I kind of tried before and it worked quite well. Ask one person to kind of feedback from their group. So it gets 5 people talking. You might do that a few weeks later or following week, and might put in the same group, but just with the rule or the sort of the scenario that this time I want to hear somebody else feedback from the group. So what it does is it gets a little bit of, people coming. So now you've got 10 people in that group who've given feedback over 2 sessions. So that's kind of maybe one idea. Something I've really had to work on, Cormac, but you know, it sometimes works as well, is being comfortable in silence when you kind of put the questions out.
Yeah.
This is maybe coming with my lecture ahead now, but sometimes you kind of ask a question to a full room, and there will be silence because people are unsure what to say, or sometimes. So just being comfortable in that silence and being comfortable to stay silent and not being the first one to speak again, because sometimes what can happen is I ask a question and people know, well, I'll answer it myself if I stay silent long enough. So I've learned to be comfortable in silence, not to answer my own questions. But really the message I'm sending out there is, I really value what you have to say here, and I really want to hear it. So kind of, even if it's, you know, what I do in my head is I count to 10, and I count very slowly to 10. So sometimes that could be 15 seconds of silence. That feels like an age. I'm keeping myself busy by counting in my head, so I'm okay. But eventually what I tend to find is somebody will say something and it gets the ball rolling. And you might even want to pass that on, you know, even like if Sean speaks, you might say, well, what do you think here? Or something like that, you know, just to get the conversation going. Those are maybe a few thoughts.
That's great. Chris Grady?
Yeah, thanks very much, lads. Noel, you may have answered this question already in a previous answer. But I'm going to maybe ask you in a different way. How do you deal with a player? How have you dealt with a player that's maybe kind of self-indulgent or maybe indulgent himself, where no matter what instructions he gets from managers or coaches, after a certain time in the game, he reverts the type and he starts to play his own game, and he sees the game different than everyone else. You could even say he gives you you might get the body language that he knows more than manager or coach, and you know there is players like that, and he could be playing centre forward, but he's playing sweeper, and he's doing things that are not part of the game plan, and it happens repeatedly, and you know, over and over again without being dealt with, you know, despite instruction. Have you come across that, and how to deal with a player in that situation?
I suppose the first question is, do you know what the player sees, or, you know, has there ever been a conversation with the player where it's like, what are their thoughts in that time, or what are they seeing in that time, or do you know? And really, what I'm asking there is, do they see what you see? Do you think?
Yeah, I would say the conversations have been had many times, but it still goes back to the same thing. But maybe it's a maturity thing. But no, I get your point. It's probably regularly honing in on what that player is seeing, I suppose. Yeah, that's the answer, really.
I don't know if it's the complete answer, Chris, and I suppose it's hard to kind of answer fully out of context. But I suppose you know, I can only speak about, you know, my kind of philosophy of things sometimes. But I think, you know, sometimes it's just having that very open, honest conversation about, this is what I see. What do you see? What, you know, here's an example of, you know, this is our game plan. This is how we try to do things as a group. This is what I'm seeing as a coach in terms of you going away from that, or whatever it might be. But then getting the players' view on that, getting the players' input on that. It may not always work. It, you know, sometimes it depends on the individual. But again, it might be that sort of thing of they're not seeing that picture, or they might even think, yeah, but that is what I'm doing. You know, so it might be just speaking a different language always, and that's why I kind of start off with that approach first. It's hard to say out of context after that, but that would certainly be my first kind of conversation in that context.
Okay, thank you, Noel.
Right, we're gonna take two more. If you don't mind, Noel, we'll take two more here.
Tony. Yeah.
Kevin Dobbs, I have given you a chance to unmute yourself there. Good.
Just a quick question from me. You talked about language. I guess familiar with the term mental toughness and resilience. Are they the same? Are they first cousins, or how would you describe those, Tony? Mental toughness versus resilience.
Yeah, different terms, and to be honest, the idea of mental toughness I don't particularly like. But yeah, so certainly in the research literature, those are considered different things. and mental toughness is considered, different to resilience. I guess a lot of these terms really with resilience, the sort of ideas here are, like resilience being something that we can sort of develop proactively. It's something that we can, there's different views in it, but it's something that we can use to help maintain performance, maintain well-being when under pressure. There's also something called rebound resilience, which is even if we experience a dip in performance or well-being, that we can recover from that, rebound from that. So really, I suppose mental toughness is not particularly a concept or an idea that I like very much. Mental toughness in the literature comprises a lot of things around like confidence, etc. And for me, I kind of rather work on those individual concepts than this idea of mental toughness. But yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so the last one here, there's a question in the chat box here. Noel, we see.
Yep.
Getting good feedback here. There's one here from Dermot. Any tips for managing the feeling of rejection for young teenage players, etc.? Managing game time. Am I starting and avoiding player dropout issues due to rejection feelings? Thanks.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Dermot. For me, I think actually, part of that number one goes back to, the bit I was talking about at the end there around relationships. I think number one, I think it's absolutely a normal reaction that if you don't get started or if you don't get the game time you want, you're going to feel disappointed and you're going to feel that little bit of you use the phrase or the word rejection there. For me, I suppose, I think it's important to go back to the relationships piece, right? What actions as a coach am I taking in response to that? And one action could be that player's not my plans, they're not my starting team, and the player almost feels ignored. And I guess that really is a rejection. But also that idea of, even though you're not starting, right, am I still supporting that player? Am I still helping that player to improve? Am I giving them feedback? Is it that very honest conversation of, these are maybe some reasons why you're not starting. Here are some things you can do that might help with that, might work on that. So you're still supporting the player in that. And I, this is just a thought, but I would suggest that even though a player can feel disappointed, they can also feel supported by your actions as a coach. So that's maybe one idea about having that, and that can be kind of challenging for you as a coach because you've maybe got to focus on a certain group of players. But I think also keeping those other players as part of your, keeping those connections, those relationships with that other player as well is quite important.
I think we've covered a lot of angles, Noel. Thank you so much. It's a so important topic in the GAA with coaches and all. So thank you so much, Noel. It's been a brilliant presentation. Now, just for the wee video that didn't work, Noel sent it through to me, the Jim Gavin one, and I will send it on to you and all. And as I said at the start, this presentation is being recorded and it'll be up on the Ulster GAA YouTube page in a few days. So you'll be able to watch it again. What else? Just to finish off, Jamie, my friend here in the background, Jamie's put up the feedback sheet again, the evaluation sheet. A few ones was asking about it. Jamie's put it up again. Could you please fill it up? All it'll take you is 5 minutes. Tick box it. It's a lot of tick boxing stuff, and also it's not going to take up a lot of your time tonight. Just please, it's good for us moving forward. Thank you, and remember, I put them other 2 sessions up. Remember, attacking play and Gaelic football practical session, 13th of March, and the week after, back to basics of goalkeeping, both in the Mid-Ulster Sports Arena at 7:15. And if you're not there, it'll not be recorded. So you need to be there to see the sessions. Thank you so much, coaches. And again, thank you, Noel. Brilliant.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks, everyone.